Hi everyone, Dave here from a very foggy Leeds in my back garden, sat on my old Saltergate seats as always to introduce this week's episode of the podcast. Now this week, how do you write about football? That's something I've been thinking about recently, as I've been doing obviously a bit of writing for the fanzine, and quite a lot of supporters have written their first ever pieces about football for the fanzine as well. So this week I spoke to Daniel Gray. Now, I was on the When Saturday Comes podcast a few weeks back now talking about Chesterfield, and it was Dan that did that segment. So he's very kindly agreed to return the favour. I've always been a big fan of his writing anyway. He's very much a writer that comes from the approach of being in the stands rather than the press box. He's absolutely brilliant at picking up those things that people say on the way to matches or during matches and getting those little nuggets of that match day experience into a book. His latest book, The Silence of the Stands, which is here, is out now and is all about that period coming out of COVID when people were going to games again for the first time. Those kind of, people being 2 metres apart and are you allowed to sing or not, all that stuff. And he picks up on some great little bits of kind of social history that he notes down in this book. If you're not a big reader, it's in very accessible bite-sized chunks of chapters that are all about specific matches. If you are a big reader, then the way he talks and the metaphors and things that he uses about football are absolutely brilliant, so do check it out. As always, I am on Instagram and Twitter as @SpireLegends, and also on Facebook if you just search Legends of the Spire. And the new fanzine, actually, funnily enough, should be out this week as well. So look out for it. But in the meantime, here we are with Daniel Gray talking about his latest book, The Silence of the Stands. Go get it, and here we go. I've just been working my way through your new book, which I have there, which it is just those universal things that we all kind of didn't realise that we missed, but we did miss, didn't we, throughout those whole COVID times?
Yeah.
It must have been nice for you being one of the first people to go back into all those games again.
Yeah, but of course there was a guilt about it because some of them were behind closed doors, so it was on the press pass. And then the first proper chapter in the book is Middlesbrough, my team, getting a ticket when there was only 1,000 available in those experimental games. So there was a certain guilt, and then there was the not being the same. So you've not got your rituals, and we know how much going to football is about rituals and doing the same thing and seeing the same people. So you're going on your own. I can't drive, so I'm on the train and I was walking to the ground and no one else was walking to the ground. You were instructed it where possible to drive to the ground because it was safer. So in your head, the Friday night, you're picturing the usual burger vans and people strolling towards all those wonderful moments before 3:00. But of course, it's just you and safety checks into the car park, safety checks into the ground. So different. But I can't deny it when it came just before 3:00 and people were singing, sort of checking, are we allowed to sing in that particular game? It was a rare moment of goosebumps in a year of few, I think.
I remember the first match we were allowed back at Chesterfield. I think it was Dagenham, was it? It was like the last day of the season. And we were all sat in twos. So it looked like a really full stadium, but it was just that everyone was sat in twos or threes or fours and things like that. And it was a very surreal experience, wasn't it?
Yeah, and these games that I could get to were in different stages of restrictions. So when it looked like things were opening up again in the September, going to Lancaster, that was fairly open, except there was crosses on the ground for people to stand on the terraces. Ticker tape, different types of tape at the various bars and tea huts at Lancaster and things like that. So there were, and the 2 meter distancing in the queues, and then Workington was similar. Kendal was a day when there was going to be a press conference that night, and that was the sweeping around the terrace. Or Boris Johnson speaking at 5, he's speaking at 6, and you have this awareness it's going to be the last game for a while. And then suddenly Southport were able to play just before Christmas because they counted as the Liverpool region, which had gone up through the divisions, which is why it was like a sort of macabre promotion and relegation system. So I got down there, people, you'll never get over people in masks queuing to get through the turnstiles as a surreal part of life. But it doesn't seem real, a lot of it. I knew I was writing the book, so I was taking notes the whole way through of all these different phrases at the time as well, all these things we got used to. And so and yet still looking back now to talk about the book, it doesn't feel real. A lot of it
Yeah.
somehow. Um, we'll know one day about the wisdom of some of the policies, but some of them were darkly funny. We all remember the pork pie stuff, but it pertained to football as well, where it looked like you could drink in the club bar, but you couldn't watch the match if it was going on outside the club bar. So there's people peeking through the curtains and things like that. Whereas, of course, we know now that being in a bar was much worse for COVID than being on a terrace.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
yeah.
I love a lot of those conversations as well that you've managed to kind of note down and kind of preserve. There's one where someone's talking about, this is one of our favorite spots, and they say, oh, apart from when it stank of fish. And there's some really weird people talking about what work they've had done during lockdowns. It's like people having catch-ups, isn't it? Because they've not seen each other.
Yeah.
They've not had that weekly or fortnightly interaction at home matches.
Absolutely. Talking on corners. I think we missed talking on corners, and one of the great things about not being able to drive is doing everything by public transport. So you hear more on buses and trains. And I never use anyone's correct names, I hasten to add. But yeah, there are brilliant moments like that. The Southport game reminds me it was coming up to Christmas, and there was two women on, I think it was, I can't remember if I heard them on a bus or a train, and they were talking about what chocolate they liked. And one of them said, I can't stand bounties though, none of that defecated coconut stuff. And you just thought, there are moments when you're writing a book of doubt, but there are many moments where you think, I've got to write this because that line deserves to be in a book. And yeah, it happens at football, and outside football. But out at Southport, the two men outside the club shop, just overhearing them chatting and saying about how their lockdown was, as if it was how your Christmas was, and one of them going, "Oh, quiet," and then they're both really laughing, and that sums up the sort of the weary, dark humour of the time, I think.
Yeah. So you've done a lot of writing about football. So I wondered what are the things that you love about football? Because it's not always necessarily the game, is it?
No, and far from it. Obviously, there are those moments that we go for, but I think if we're honest, maybe 1 in 5 or 6 or 10 games are absolutely brilliant. Maybe fewer, depends on your team and the season they're having. So for me, as long as I can remember, I've been going since I was 6. It's been so much more. It's been about waking up that morning, the different feeling you have on a football day, and then onwards through I mentioned the word rituals, the people you see, the things you do the same throughout a home game, all of those, and looking around at the crowd. I do watch the game, but observing those things. I go to football quite a lot on my own as well, to different grounds. I go to Middlesbrough with a friend with a season ticket, but elsewhere I travel around, and that gives you a sharper eye, I think, for if you're not busy chatting to someone, for looking around and observing how we behave and the things we do and say as fans, and all of those minutiae of the game. I've done a few books called the Delights series where I try and capture those. So it starts with things like seeing a ground from the train is the very first one of those 3 books of 50 delights of football. It's all of what, the word is the minutiae about it. And thankfully, I found with those books that we share these things, whatever team we support, no matter the size of the team. That's the thing.
And it all changes throughout time as well, doesn't it? Because I remember growing up, we always used to get the green and after the match, and it'd come out like an hour after the final whistle, and you have a printed green newspaper with like a match report with a few typos in it.
Yeah.
But
the middle one of those
fantastic.
books is called Black Boots and Football. Pink's same thing exactly, and that's unashamedly nostalgic. That one, that's about things that have mostly gone, whereas the other 2 books are about things that are still hopefully in the game. And wallowing in nostalgia is not a bad thing. Politically, it's a troublesome thing at times. It leads to certain political decisions that aren't great. But personally, and in football, I think it was really important in COVID, actually, because we were able to fall back on highlights. Dare I mention 3-3 Old Trafford between our 2 teams, and all the rest of it. And I felt really relieved to have that bank of memories and nostalgia, and those items. Before we came on air, we were talking about scarves and different things that we own, and foam hands, and to have those items in your hand. I know people can't see it's a podcast, but the one I found recently was my Borough Nut, which these are early 90s things that each club's had advertised in Shoot and 90 Minutes and things, and you hold them again, and you back there, and there's not that much wrong. it's harmless to be comforted by going back, and football pinks are one of those things. And I think it's a tremendous strength of being a football person is nostalgia, really, because very often, as you've lived through with Chesterfield in more recent years, the present can be pretty awful. So you need a past to wallow in, I think.
I regularly go down a rabbit hole of eBay,
Yeah.
kind of finding old things that are on there, like old rosettes and all that different type of stuff. It's just, I love the physicalness,
Absolutely.
like the ephemera of football. That's why I started doing the zine again, just because you kind of think a lot of things start to go digital. It's kind of the natural way of things. A lot of football clubs don't have a lot of money, so it's natural that a lot of things go digital. But having like a paper thing, it's just nice, isn't it?
It really is. I was so glad. One of the reasons that, well, the main reason we met was you doing a paper fanzine again, and it's a really it's a resurgence, actually. I wouldn't. It's quite a strong word, but there are a number of newer fanzines as well as some that have maintained, and it's definitely about that. And it's not just people of our age; it's younger as well. Suddenly realizing that it's quite nice to look away from a screen every now and again.
Yeah.
A fanzine you can read really beautifully with a pint. Scrolling through your phone is going to lead to the usual anxiety, whereas a nice bit of paper won't. And all of those, I've been just doing a big tidy up in our house and putting all my memorabilia in one place. It's been a really lovely process, and I found this one old mug of pens of loads of different clubs. There's Oldham, Halifax, all sorts of clubs in there, and it just brought back that in the early 90s, early to mid 90s, when my dad was looking after me after mum and dad had split up, in those long summers and couldn't think what to do, we would drive off from York, where I grew up, to different football grounds and buy a pen. And I've got all of these pens, and so I pick up the Halifax one, and I remember that Jimmy Case, the former Liverpool midfielder himself, sold me that pen, because we went into this building in the middle of Halifax after the person at the Shea directed us there, and it was the club offices, and he was there. He was manager of Halifax at the time, and he was manning the stall and gave me the pen. So I've got my Jimmy Case pen in this mug, and all of these others, and each one spirals me off to a different day during those couple of summers with my dad, and that can never be felt about a tweet. That's a long-winded way of grumbling about modernity, but there you are.
Yeah, I met a guy for the latest fanzine who has collected over the last few years every home, away, and third Chesterfield kit for the last kind of 20, 30 years, and he's got them in a little box room. And he's got these 2 rails of shirts, all in date order, most of them match worn. Yes. And he's kind of talking about how, he got the first one, and then he was like, oh, there's probably 6 or 7 I'd quite like to have. And then he gets those, and then you think, oh, actually, I quite like getting the match worn thing now. And then you kind of get more and more and more. And it was the same with me as well. Growing up, I used to go to my dad to watch Nottingham Hoods, American football team, when British American football was kind of a thing. And each game you could buy a little plastic American football helmet for each of the teams in the NFL. Yeah. And each time we went, I would get one. And eventually I had all of the 30 odd teams at the time that were in the NFL. And like those things that you just buy at the grounds and stuff, it's just great.
Yeah. I think I remember those. Did they almost fit in a thimble? I could picture them in a
kind of 50p size.
In a grandma's thimble collection.
Yeah.
Putting them in one of those wooden cases, that'll be a thing of beauty.
Yeah. Oh, they're amazing. So how does writing about football change how you watch football? Because I've noticed when I've started doing the podcast talking to footballers, I think I behave a lot differently at football matches. I have a bit of a different appreciation of who they are, what they go through on a pitch, all of that stuff. And I watch the game a bit differently. I wonder, as a writer, does that then change how you watch a football match?
A similar thing because I do podcasting as well through other things I do. I edit a football magazine called Nutmeg, a Scottish football magazine, and I interview footballers for that as well. So I've gone through that as well. Of being a lot more sympathetic around injury, around the psychology and mental health around injury, around fan abuse. So I've gone through that with podcasting as well. That's interesting. With writing, I think I watch Middlesbrough differently to how I watch other games, neutral games on my own. I watch them with looking for things all the time. I watch Middlesbrough in the same way I always did, which is irrationally, ridiculously, and with no reason, just full love and all of the rest. But other football, I'm definitely watching with a keener eye on what the physicality of certain players that might make for a good description. I don't mean to be nasty. I hope I never am. That's not me. Just the way they run, who they remind me of, what's a good simile about them, what's a good metaphor that I could be using, what does the referee look like? So I'll almost do like that player cam Sky used to do, and I'll watch someone for a long time if I think I'm going to write about that person, and so that's different. I'm not really looking at the game as a I could never write about tactics or transfers. It doesn't interest me anyhow. But so I'm looking for stories like that, really. Yeah. If I early on see someone that looks good when they're running out, I think I hope he does something so I can mention this. Do 200 words on the way he runs or something like that. So definitely. But there are different ways of watching different teams, aren't there? It's quite relaxing going to a neutral game, whereas watching Chesterfield is a different heart rate for you, isn't it? I think.
Yeah, I've been to watch Garforth Town, which is my most local club to me, and I've been there to watch it a few times. And it's funny because they have an incredibly, obviously small main stand where you find yourself sat in front of, the director of the club, and you find them talking about all sorts that you think, I don't know if I should be tab hanging on to all of this, but you hear some really interesting nuggets. So it does change, doesn't it? Like you say, who you support to. But it's nice to get that appreciation sometimes of a football match away from the feelings of having to see your team win or that stuff, isn't it?
And I've written about this in a couple of books, but I'll never lose that feeling of seeing a different ground for the first time when you come round a corner in a town you don't know and see its shapes, its different statues, its different architecture, atmosphere, different things on sale in the hatch. All of this, the green for the first time still gets me like it did when I was 6, and as long as that continues, I'll still be traveling around and having itchy feet on a Saturday without football, which really was the root of Silence of the Stands.
Really. Yeah. I wondered, seeing as we've got you here, how would you suggest that people that want to write about football go about writing about it? Is it as simple as just writing about it?
I've never thought too much about it. That's the first useless tip, but they're on the right lines if they're writing for the fanzine. I would say that's where I started. If I am anywhere now, that's where I started. The Middlesbrough fanzine, Fly Me to the Moon. I can vividly remember my first article being printed and getting a copy when Rob, who still edits it now, came round the pub against Liverpool in 2003, and I must have written. I've got them all behind me still. Actually, I must have written. I don't know, 80 odd issues in a row. I was almost religious about having to be in it. Don't look at them now. I never really read back much of my old stuff, but I dare say I must have improved. I hope I improved through just writing and writing and writing. And I'm surprised when I look back at things of my own, like old boxes Mum gives me of school books, that I was writing football reports when I was about 10. And then I found a diary from when I was 14 the other day, and I just flicked through it and it was full, and I thought, I don't remember writing a diary. Was this about girls or what? How embarrassing. And I opened and every one of them was a match report of Middlesbrough and York City as well. And I thought, God, I have no recollection of that, but it must have been in me the whole time that I wanted to record. And it wasn't just about who'd scored, it was the same things about what had happened that day and around the match. And so that'd be my main thing, is just to write and write and write, really. And more crucially to me, to read. I still read a lot of football books and other books as well, but at the minute I'm reading a brilliant book about Rochdale 73-74 season, and that from that I've just it's really brilliant short sentences, and that's a wonderful way of writing. And I'm always getting stuff going into past classic books as well, football and non. I just think it sounds the most ridiculous tips in the world, but it's just to write loads and read loads is all I really have to give. I think I do. I suppose if I think about the writing process itself, I'm a big planner. So a chapter in a book, I'll have it all laid out as a big essay plan type thing, and I'll order it before I start, and I'll have it'll be quite structured like that, really, and then tick things off physically on a printed sheet as I go through them. So quite organised about it. Not very romantic and artistic, but the notebooks are. I hope that the ideas start with the notebooks at the match.
So you don't kind of record anything at matches? Do you generally just write things down then?
Yeah, I have been tempted by that. Apart from how mad you look, I have done a few sort of fake phone calls coming out of matches and held the phone up like that and put it into voice notes, especially on freezing cold days. The practicalities of it are your hand doesn't work quite often in some of these places. But actually, the greatest suspicion I've had is when you're writing things in a little notebook, people do look at you. Funnily, I do photo essays with a brilliant photographer called Alan McCready for the aforementioned Nutmeg magazine. We go around different grounds doing different themes, and he, with his big, photograph, big cameras and all the rest, gets no suspicion. People are just happy. He just gets on. Me with my notebook, really funny looks. So everyone's got very used to having the photo taken. One of the books I did 10 years ago now, I think, Hatters, Railwaymen and Knitters. That was another travel book around just English football. And at Luton, Hatters, a steward tried to remove my pen just while I was taking notes. He came to me and said, "What are you writing, son?" And we've had some bad things written about the club. Really, really odd. Really odd. Sort of freedom of speech implications and all the rest. And actually, they were getting a really good write up until that point. And at that point, I thought, you're not now.
Change the
absolutely
article.
Obscene. I believe it's a very changed club now, I have to emphasise. But
I suppose some visiting fans will probably think you're a scout as well.
They'll
think, right, which one of our players is he after?
Yeah, he's a scruffy git in his parka. And
they're looking to see if there's a club badge on your jumper or anything like that. You'll have to start just going in branded jumpers of different clubs.
I know. Oh, if only. That's one thing, I suppose. I've never written. I went in the press boxes to get to the behind closed doors games in Scotland, but otherwise I've always written from the terraces, and that would be my point of view. I'm not a press box match reporter. I'm full of admiration for writers that can just do an on the whistle match report. I find it so stressful. But that would be me. My niche. There are many people that have this niche. I don't know if it's a niche, but is to write from the terraces, really.
Yeah. Brilliant. And a word as well, like you say, you're reading about Rochdale from years gone by, is like the historians and the volunteers of football clubs.
Yeah.
They're like because obviously I kind of work in the arts sector, so I kind of sympathise to how clubs work, in that it's like next match, and you're constantly on like a treadmill of looking at the next one and the next one. So the clubs don't always have a lot of time to look backwards at history of clubs and things like that. But a lot of the work done by club historians and volunteers that all do it for free. At Chesterfield, we have Stuart Basson and Paul Kellett, and they've been incredibly helpful throughout all the podcasting that I've done and interviews, because they keep team lineups of the last 30, 40 years, so I can look at what matches players played in 1983 or whatever, and they've been great for contacts as well. So I assume it's people that you've kind of come across all over as well.
Invaluable, a huge service to not just to the game and to fans, but to social history, because football as a type of social history is neglected. Really, it's almost laughed upon. There are academics doing good football study, but if you try and place it with the rest of societal history, you get a bit, in certain quarters, a bit laughed at, and you shouldn't, because it's popular history. But yeah, the every historian, every club I've ever approached has just been so helpful. And there could be gatekeepers. They could say, "No, I've done all that research. That's mine. What are you doing with it?" It's never happened to me. I send off. I often even said that Southport, a brilliant guy, Dan, who's just done a book himself. I sent off the whole chapter just saying, "Would you mind reading it?" And he just brilliant, read it through, really helpful. And it's happened with every book I've done. They just can't share their love almost enough, and I'm so glad they exist, because, as you say, no one's ever really made any money out of being a football club historian. So that is a real pursuit of true love, really.
And I know in terms of the ones at Chesterfield, they kind of spend a lot of time going back in time, looking at newspaper reports and things like that to try and build every lineup of every game. Going back for decades and decades and decades. And I spoke to a player, Bennett Steele, who played alongside Gordon Banks for Chesterfield in the 1950s, and it was great to see every match that he'd played in, and he didn't think he'd played in the same team as Gordon Banks, because he played the first half and Gordon Banks the second half, but they had in his last game, and he was like, "I played alongside him, I didn't realise." So it's amazing, like the work that
That's superb, isn't it? Being able to tell that story like that. And you're right about football clubs. They don't. It's a shame it isn't a paid role, really, because they're not obliged almost to do it and have a nice little museum. So it falls to these people to collect every team sheet, every program, and I'm just so glad they're there because they are curating the history of these fine institutions, where the institutions themselves aren't perhaps that bothered beyond giving it 2 pages in the program.
Really. Yeah. So we should go back to 1997. Obviously, Middlesbrough fan. So where did it all start for you? Is it like a passed down Middlesbrough?
No,
Middlesbrough
well,
fan,
my parents are from West Yorkshire, actually, where you are, but we lived on Teesside when I was born, and my dad he gave me 2 choices to support Leeds, his team, or Middlesbrough, so he took me to Borough in December 1988, and they drew 3-3 against Aston Villa. He took me to Leeds early in 1990, and they drew 0-0 with Oldham Athletic, and I suspect it was the 6 goals.
Logical decision
for me. So it could have gone so differently. I never would have seen a trophy if I'd supported Leeds, though, whereas I have seen us win 1 trophy. And yet, ever since, moved to York when I was 4, so always travelling for matches. But also used to go to Bootham Crescent a lot and watch York. It worked out perfectly for that. So there were seasons when I was at a game every week, thanks to that. I have a Bootham Crescent turnstile in my garden now, which I had to get. I bought
what
at auction.
Brilliant ground that was.
Yeah, absolutely.
Of grounds that it's like the walk to the ground. That
beautiful.
Was like top notch.
And a proper day out. You used to see families coming for the day out, and without stereotyping too much, the dad going off to the match and the family, it's just LNERs. I was there for the promotion game last year, and it was good. It was loud. You've been through all this, all this. But there were night matches when you can't get back into town if you can't drive, and that's got to be a backward step but yes, so Borough going ever since, season tickets, all the rest, all the big moments through the years, and the many downs, the many relegations, and York have had a similar vicissitudes, ups and downs in that time as well.
Yeah, so obviously Chesterfield and Middlesbrough shared an epic game in that 97 3-3, and I've spoken to loads of players that were in that match. It's interesting kind of hearing the stories of, Mark Williams was spending his time trying to kick the ball out the ground because he liked to do that everywhere he visited. And John Duncan, who's obviously sadly no longer with us, still kind of kicks himself as why they didn't attack. When they went to 3-3, he was like, I said, settle in, boys. It's 3-3. And it's like, we should have just attacked that last minute. But kind of as a Chesterfield fan, we obviously look at the goal that never was and things like that. But how was it from your side of things? You got to a cup final. It was a great game.
Yeah. I was behind the goal at that one with my mum, actually. Dad couldn't take me. And it's my main memory is the Hewitt equaliser, because I thought we definitely got out of jail, and it was a spectacular comeback. And that just the time it seemed to take to go in. It was the header that in my head is still somewhere in orbit. Now it took that long. And that is the one I really remember about that day, because of course the goal that didn't stand. When you're there, and this is before the sentence before social media, as the sentence seemed to say a lot, but there's no going away and hearing loads and loads about it. It might on Radio 5 in the car, it might have said, "Oh, Chesterfield robbed" or something, but you're not immersed in it like you are now. You can't discuss it for hours. You saw it then, and you probably all knew. You were like, I'm sure that went in. Whereas we were all like, that can't have gone in. and that's it till you get to see a highlight at some stage if you remember to set the video recorder. I think it was on Sky, that one, wasn't it? And so it doesn't go on now like you were the famous talking points that pundits go on about. It probably was, but only in our own memories, which I like. I like that. It was our own one interpretation of things instead of seen 1,000 times over. And of course, we know now it was a goal and you were robbed. But that whole season is I must have been so 96, 97, I must have been 14 and 15 years old. So that's when you probably care most about football. I still care a lot now, as is probably hopefully coming across, but it's just so vital to you. And I had my season ticket. That was the year I went to my first ever away game on my own. I went down to Derby when Emerson had gone missing. So it just was endlessly dramatic. But it's interesting watching it become quite romanticised by Borough fans, especially who weren't there, who talk about the games like that and the highs, when I remember loads of awful home defeats and dreadful defending by Vickers and Pearson and White and all the rest at the back. And it just gets wiped. We did go down though. I cried at Elland Road and then suddenly thought, I'm going to be that kid on Match of the Day. I better stop. On the last day with Janino on the turf. But it is interesting watching it become more and more romanticised. I remember 0-1 Sunderland at home, just my heart being breaking at that one, and various defeats like that. I'm not ready to be too romantic about it.
Yeah, like you say, 2 cup finals, but a relegation. And it's interesting, but it seems to happen quite a lot, doesn't it? Cup finals, or even cup wins and relegation. They seem to go hand in hand quite a lot. We had it with the Johnson's Paint Trophy.
Yeah, you expend all your energy when you're not a big club, don't you? Expend emotionally and physically all the players' energy on. You can't do it all really unless you've got the wealth to do so.
Yeah, definitely. How has kind of football changed for you, do you think? Because I've noticed a big difference, like post-COVID, certainly at Chesterfield. Obviously, we've had lots of bad things happening over the last few years. It's been a proper treadmill of horror over the last few years. But it seems like after COVID happened, there was a real resurgence in crowds, especially in non-league and local matches and regional football and stuff like that. You obviously go around visiting lots of these clubs. So have you kind of noticed a difference in it?
Certainly in the first season back, I felt the atmosphere was different. I thought it was more vibrant, more raw than it had been for a long, long time. Just the shared feeling of being back there again, and the relief, that's probably the main word of it. And I also felt players and teams had a long honeymoon period that ran into September and October almost, with results don't matter that much. We're here, we're back in the pub at 1 o'clock, we're seeing that fella whose name we don't know that we sit next to, and all of this. Certainly in that first year, I also felt it led to some worse behaviour as well. I don't want to sound like an old man, but I, as I've mentioned, go everywhere by train, and I did feel that as well. There was almost it let out all types of relief at football and around match days and things. I think it's a bit calmer this year, but I do think it's something's shifted, and I hope, and I think numbers are bearing this out, that people that couldn't go to league football because it was behind closed doors and did drift to non-league, I think some of them are going back, and I hope they continue to go back, and I hope they go back over the next few weekends when the Premier League and Championship aren't in action, and go to the National League and North and South and all of the rest of it. But I do think we found our love again, and I felt the players and fans had a renewed appreciation of each other and what our roles were. I don't know how long it's lasted. I think it's probably back to normal now in that relationship, but maybe that's not such a bad thing.
Yeah, there is something glorious about going to a non-league game, both teams playing 4-4-2, big man, little man up front.
Yeah,
it feels I've noticed myself going to a few more kind of non-league games just local to me in Leeds.
Yeah.
Now when Chesterfield are not playing and things like that, because there's just something glorious about it, isn't there?
Yeah, I think when people feel jaded, which they regularly do with football at the top, I certainly do. I don't watch that much Premier League. Any non-league visit revitalizes what you first loved about the game, and it's preserved a lot of those things. And I nearly everyone I know that makes those trips comes away feeling like that. Even if the game's not great, they've got back to the core of why they first went.
And that lack of VAR, I think that has a massive effect, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Being able to celebrate a goal,
it's
knowing that you can celebrate a goal.
It's one of the key reasons I'm happy with Borough. I'm happy with a cup run and a defeated playoff season is my aim these days, because avoid VAR, avoid the Premier League. Not sure the people that tried to bring money into the club would say the same. But
so if people want to read more of your work or anything like that, where do they go?
Yeah, my own website is Daniel Gray Writer, and I sell signed books on there, or the books are in all the usual places online and elsewhere.
Great. I've got to say, it's one of those books that you read and it makes you want to firstly go to football matches, which is great. And it does make you want to write about football matches, or at least kind of zone into experiencing different things while you're at a football match. Because there's just hilarious things that happen at matches that sometimes you forget about. But you have to kind of
at 5 o'clock. Yeah, that's the thing. That's the thing with the notepad. Definitely. Yeah. Thank you.
one goal in injury time, or especially if you're supporting the club, can completely change your day, can't it?
Yeah, absolutely. There aren't many things like that either.
Yeah,
that can be changed in a second like that.
No, true. Great. Well, thanks very much for joining me.
Thank you. Brilliant.